The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, right in the middle of a budget meeting that was already running 2 hours too long. David Mitchell's phone buzzed against the conference table, and he almost ignored it. But the caller ID said First National Bank, and they never called unless something was seriously wrong. He excused himself, stepped into the hallway, and answered. "Mr. Mitchell? This is Patricia Gaines from First National. I'm calling because there's a situation that requires your immediate attention." The woman's voice carried that particular strain of professional concern that made David's stomach tighten. He'd heard it before, when his father died, when his business partner's wife filed for divorce. It was the voice people used when they didn't want to be the ones delivering bad news. "What kind of situation?" "Sir, your wife is here at our downtown branch. She's attempting to close your joint savings account and transfer the funds. That's not unusual in itself, but—" Patricia paused, and David could hear papers shuffling. "She's here with a man who, well, our manager flagged it because he says the man looks exactly like you. Like identical. But it's clearly not you, because you're on the phone with me right now." David felt the hallway tilt slightly. "What?" "The man presented ID with your name. David Mitchell. But our system shows different signature patterns, and when we ran the account verification questions, he got your mother's maiden name wrong. Protocol requires us to freeze any large transactions and contact the primary account holder directly." His mind raced through possibilities, none of them making sense. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Don't let them leave." "Sir, we can't legally detain—" 15 minutes. David was already moving toward the elevator, his hand shaking as he jabbed the button. Behind him, someone called his name, asking about the meeting. He didn't turn around. The drive downtown should have taken 25 minutes in afternoon traffic. David made it in 12, running 2 red lights and parking illegally in a loading zone. He didn't care. His wife Nicole was in that bank with someone pretending to be him, trying to drain their savings, $47,000 they'd spent 6 years accumulating. Money for the house they'd been planning to buy. Money that represented every sacrifice, every skipped vacation, every maybe next year. The bank's glass doors reflected his face back at him as he pushed through, wild-eyed, tie askew, a man on the edge of something he couldn't name yet. Patricia Gaines met him just inside, a small woman with steel-gray hair and the wary expression of someone who'd seen too many domestic disputes spill into her lobby. "They're in conference room B," she said quietly. "Mr. Mitchell, I should warn you." But David was already past her, following the signs down a carpeted hallway. He could hear Nicole's voice before he saw her, that familiar cadence he'd fallen in love with 13 years ago at a terrible poetry reading in college. She was laughing at something, the sound bright and genuine in a way it hadn't been in months. He pushed open the door without knocking. Nicole sat at a table with a man who had David's face. Not similar. Not close. Exact. Same dark hair with premature gray at the temples. Same nose that had been broken playing high school football and never quite healed straight. Same scar through the left eyebrow from a childhood accident with a treehouse. The man even sat the way David sat, one leg crossed over the other, hands folded on the table. The only difference was the expression. This man wore David's face with a confidence David had never possessed, a ease in his own skin that made something twist painfully in David's chest. Nicole's laughter died when she saw him. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, guilt, something that might have been relief, and finally a kind of weary resignation. "David," she said. Just his name, flat and tired. The man who wore David's face stood up slowly, and even that movement was familiar. The way David himself stood after sitting too long, that slight stiffness in the right knee from an old injury. How was this possible? "I think," the man said, and his voice was David's voice. "We should probably all sit down." David couldn't move, couldn't process. His wife was here with his exact double, trying to steal their life savings, and the man wanted them to sit down like this was a business meeting? "Who the hell are you?" The words came out strangled. The man's expression shifted to something like sympathy. "My name is Daniel Mitchell. And before you ask, yes, we're twins. Identical twins, separated at birth through a private adoption that our biological mother arranged before she died." The room seemed to contract. David grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. "That's not... My parents would have told me." "Your parents didn't know," Daniel said gently. "Our birth mother was 17, scared, and working with an adoption agency that specialized in what they called discrete placement, meaning they actively separated twins because single babies were easier to place. She was told we'd both go to good homes. She was told we'd both be happy. She died 6 months later from complications of undiagnosed diabetes, so she never got to know if that was true." Nicole still hadn't spoken. She was watching David with an expression he couldn't read, one hand pressed flat against the table like she was holding herself down. "How did you—" David couldn't finish the question. There were too many questions. "DNA testing service," Daniel said. 3 years ago. One of those ancestry kits. It flagged me as having a close relative match. Closer than the adoptive family I'd known. I spent a year trying to decide if I should reach out. Then I saw your photo on a company website, and I knew." He pulled out his phone, scrolled through, photos, and set it on the table. David found himself moving closer despite everything, looking down at images of 2 boys who might have been the same child photographed at different moments. Birthday parties, school photos, Little League. One boy growing up in suburban Michigan with adoptive parents who'd loved him but never told him he was adopted. Another boy growing up in Portland, Oregon, with similar parents, similar lies. "I hired a private investigator," Daniel continued, "not to invade your privacy, just to understand who you were, where you ended up, if you were happy." He glanced at Nicole, and something passed between them that made David's blood run cold. "And then, about 3 months ago, I met your wife." The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. "Nicole," David said. His voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "What is he talking about?" She finally looked directly at him, and her eyes were wet. "I didn't know at first. I was at that conference in Denver, the marketing summit. I was in the hotel bar, and he sat down next to me, and I thought—" She swallowed hard. "I thought you'd surprised me, flown out to surprise me because I'd mentioned feeling lonely, feeling like we'd lost something. But it wasn't me. No." The word was barely a whisper. "By the time I realized something was different, we'd been talking for an hour, and he told me everything, about being your twin, about finding you, about watching from a distance and wondering what it would be like to know the person who shared his exact DNA." Daniel picked up the story. "I told her I wasn't trying to replace you or disrupt your life. I just wanted to understand, to know if the things that made me who I am were nature or nurture, if we liked the same things, thought the same way, made the same choices." "And somewhere in that conversation," Nicole said, her voice gaining strength, "I realized I was talking to you, David, the version of you I fell in love with, the one who laughed easily and asked questions about my day, and actually listened to the answers. The one who wasn't buried in spreadsheets and investor calls and 5-year plans." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I know how that sounds. I know what I did was unforgivable. But for 3 months, I got to remember what it felt like to be seen." David lowered himself into a chair before his legs could give out. The anger he'd expected to feel was buried under something heavier, a grief so profound it made breathing difficult. "So this whole time," he said slowly, "you've been what, Dating my twin? Having an affair with someone who looks exactly like me but isn't me? We haven't, Nicole started. Haven't what? Haven't slept together? Haven't kissed? Haven't imagined what it would be like to just swap me out for the upgrade model? Daniel flinched at that, and David felt a savage satisfaction at cracking that calm exterior. But the satisfaction evaporated as quickly as it came, leaving only emptiness. I never wanted to hurt you, Daniel said quietly. That was never the point. I've spent 38 years wondering about the person I could have grown up with, the brother I never knew I had. And then I found you. And I saw you were successful and married and seemed happy. And I thought maybe that was enough. Maybe I didn't need to disrupt your life. But you did anyway. Because he asked questions about you, Nicole said. About who you really were, under all the stress and the ambition and the constant pushing for more. And I realized I didn't know anymore. Somewhere in the last few years, you'd become someone I couldn't reach. David wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. Because she was right, wasn't she? When was the last time he'd asked about her day and actually listened? When was the last time they'd laughed together, stayed up late talking about nothing, made love without it feeling like another item to check off a list? Why the bank? He asked instead. Why were you trying to take the money? Nicole and Daniel exchanged a look, and this time David understood what he was seeing in it. Not romance, but conspiracy. Planning. We weren't trying to steal it, Nicole said. We were trying to split it. The lawyer Daniel consulted said that in a divorce, you'd try to argue the money was marital assets you'd mostly earned. You make more than I do. You'd say you contributed more. It would turn into a fight that would eat up thousands in legal fees and turn us both bitter. So you were going to take it and run? Let me come home to an empty house and an empty account? No. Daniel pulled out a folder David hadn't noticed, opened it to reveal a sheaf of legal documents. We were going to split it evenly and put your half in a separate account in your name only. Nicole would file for divorce with the division of assets already handled. Clean, fair, no fighting. And you, David looked at his twin, this stranger who wore his face. What do you get out of this? A chance to know my brother, Daniel said simply. After the divorce, after the dust settles, I hoped maybe you'd want to meet properly. Talk. Figure out who we are to each other. The laugh that escaped David was sharp and painful. You steal my wife and think I'm going to want family dinners? I didn't steal her. She was already gone, David. You just didn't notice. The truth of it hit like a physical blow. David thought back over the past year. How many times had Nicole tried to start conversations he'd cut short because he was tired? How many date nights had he canceled for work emergencies that weren't really emergencies? How many times had she reached for him in the night and found him already asleep or pretending to be? I was trying to build something, he said, his voice cracking. That money, the job, all of it. It was supposed to be for us. For our future. But we don't have a future, Nicole said softly. We have a plan, we have a budget, we have a timeline, but we don't have each other anymore. David looked at her, really looked, and saw the truth written in every line of her face. The Nicole he'd married had been full of spontaneous joy, always dragging him to art galleries and midnight diners and concerts for bands he'd never heard of. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped asking, and he'd been relieved rather than concerned. I turned into my father, he said suddenly. The realization felt like falling. He worked himself to death chasing success, and my mother spent 20 years being lonely in the same house with him. I swore I'd never do that. But you did, Nicole said, not unkindly. We both let it happen. I stopped trying to reach you, and you stopped noticing I'd stopped. Daniel had been quiet, watching this exchange with an expression David was beginning to recognize as his own. the way his face looked when he was working through a complex problem, trying to find the right answer in a sea of variables. "I need to tell you something," Daniel said. "Something Nicole doesn't know yet." They both turned to him. "I'm sick," he continued. "Stage 3 colon cancer. Caught it late because I ignored the symptoms, kept putting off the doctor because I was, ironically, too busy with work. Treatment starts next month. Prognosis is uncertain." The room went silent. Nicole's hand flew to her mouth. "The reason I pushed Nicole to handle the bank thing today, the reason I wanted to meet you now," Daniel looked directly at David, "is because I might not have much time. And I didn't want to die without knowing my brother, without trying to fix the damage I'd caused by inserting myself into your life." David felt something crack open in his chest. This man, this stranger who was somehow his other half, had been carrying that knowledge while trying to help Nicole escape a dying marriage, while trying to orchestrate a meeting that wouldn't end in hatred. "How long have you known?" David asked. 6 weeks. "And you didn't think to lead with that? Would it have made a difference? Would you have listened to anything else I said if I'd started with, 'Hi, I'm your twin and I'm dying'?" Probably not. David would have assumed it was manipulation, a ploy for sympathy. He might have been right. "I don't know what you want me to say," David admitted. "I don't know how to process any of this." "You don't have to say anything right now," Daniel said. "The bank's going to require both of us to straighten this out, the real David Mitchell and the fake one." A ghost of a smile. "We should probably start there." They spent the next hour with Patricia Gaines and the bank manager, untangling the security protocols and confirming identities. It was surreal, watching bank employees dart glances between him and Daniel, trying to spot differences that went beyond clothing and posture. They had to bring in fingerprint verification in the end, the only truly distinguishing factor. The account was frozen pending resolution, which suited David fine. He wasn't sure he wanted the money anymore. It represented a dream that had curdled into something toxic. When the bank business was finished, the three of them stood in the parking lot in the fading afternoon light. Traffic hummed past on the street. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing music, a familiar song David couldn't quite place. "What happens now?" Nicole asked. David looked at her, at the woman he'd married and somehow lost without noticing. "You wanted a divorce?" "I think we need one." Her voice was gentle. "We've hurt each other enough, don't you think?" He did, but it still felt like losing something vital, like watching a part of his life catch fire and being unable to stop it. "I'll make it easy," he said. "No fighting. We split everything down the middle. You keep the apartment. I never liked it anyway. Too many floors up, too much glass." It was true. He'd always felt like he was living in a display case. "Thank you," Nicole said, and he could see the relief in her eyes. Then she turned to Daniel. "I need some time to figure things out. Alone." Daniel nodded, understanding. "Of course." She kissed David on the cheek, a gesture that felt like goodbye, and walked to her car. They watched her drive away. The silence that settled between them was strange, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with too much unsaid. "There's a diner 2 blocks over," Daniel said finally. "Want to get coffee or something stronger?" David should have said no, should have gotten in his car and driven home to process everything alone. Instead, he found himself saying, "Coffee's fine." They walked in silence. David kept catching glimpses of his own reflection in store windows, except the reflection was walking beside him, matching his stride without trying. It was like existing in 2 places at once. The diner was a classic. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, a menu that probably hadn't changed since 1987. They slid into a corner booth, and a waitress who looked old enough to have seen everything brought them coffee without being asked. "So," David said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Cancer." "Yeah." "What's the treatment plan?" Daniel outlined it. Chemotherapy, possible surgery, a lot of waiting and seeing. He spoke about it matter-of-factly, like he was describing a project at work rather than a fight for his life. "You're handling it better than I would," David observed. "I'm not handling it at all. I'm just going through the motions and hoping something sticks." Daniel took a sip of coffee, made a face. "This is terrible." Diners are never really about the coffee. "What are they about?" "Neutral ground. Places where you can have the conversations you can't have anywhere else." Daniel nodded slowly. "Like talking to your identical twin you didn't know existed about how he accidentally started an emotional affair with your wife? Something like that." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Daniel said, "I need you to know, Nicole and I never crossed certain lines. We talked, we laughed. Once we held hands across a table. But we didn't—" "I believe you," David interrupted. "And honestly, I'm not sure it matters. Emotional infidelity, physical infidelity, it all comes from the same place, a need that wasn't being met." "You're being remarkably calm about this." David laughed, a hollow sound. "I'm in shock. Give me a few hours and I'll probably be throwing things and making terrible decisions. Right now I'm just numb." He looked at this man who was genetically identical to him, but had lived a completely different life. "Tell me about you. The real you, not the version that was trying to understand me through Nicole." So Daniel talked. About growing up in Portland with adoptive parents who loved him, but always seemed to be waiting for him to become someone else. About a career in software development that paid well, but left him empty. About a marriage that had ended 5 years ago, because neither of them could figure out how to be happy. About hobbies. Woodworking, hiking, playing guitar badly, that filled time, but not the void. It was like listening to a version of his own life played in a different key. The specifics were different, but the melody was the same. Two men trying to figure out who they were supposed to be, chasing success that never quite satisfied, wondering if there was something fundamentally broken in how they were wired. "Do you ever feel like you're watching your own life from outside?" Daniel asked. "Like you're performing being yourself rather than actually living?" David felt something unlock in his chest. "Every day. Like there's a script I'm supposed to follow, but no one gave me all the pages. I used to think that was just me, that the adoption had somehow made me incomplete. But if you feel it too—" "Maybe it's not about adoption or childhood or any of that," David said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke. "Maybe it's just about being human. Everyone's performing a version of themselves they think they're supposed to be. That's depressing? Or liberating. Depends on whether you're willing to stop performing." Daniel smiled, and it was David's smile, but warmer somehow. "How'd you get so wise?" "Lost my wife to my identical twin today. Tends to give you perspective." They both laughed then, a genuine sound that drew glances from the other patrons. Two identical men in a corner booth, looking like a mirror that had learned to laugh at itself. "I'm sorry," Daniel said when the laughter faded. "For all of it. I thought I was being noble, trying to bring us together and help Nicole escape at the same time. But I just made everything messier." "You gave her permission to leave something that was making her miserable," David said. "That's not nothing." He paused, considering. "And you gave me a chance to meet my brother before cancer steals the opportunity." "You're calling me your brother." "What else would I call you? Some guy who happens to share my DNA? We're twins, Daniel. We lost 38 years, but we don't have to lose whatever comes next." Daniel's eyes went bright with tears. He didn't let fall. "I was afraid you'd hate me." "I might still, when the shock wears off. But right now, I'm just grateful you exist. That somewhere out there, there's someone who understands what it's like to be me in a way no one else ever could." They talked for hours. The coffee went cold and was replaced with fresh cups that also went cold. The dinner crowd came and went. The waitress eventually left them alone, recognizing the kind of conversation that needed space. David learned about the small scar on Daniel's left hand from a woodworking accident, the way he always ordered pancakes with the syrup on the side, his habit of drumming his fingers when he was thinking through a problem. Small things, mundane things, that added up to a person. And in return, he shared himself. Not the polished version he showed the world, but the messy reality underneath. The anxiety that woke him at 3 a.m. convinced he'd made irreversible mistakes. The way he sometimes drove past his old childhood home just to remember what it felt like to be certain of his place in the world. The fear that he was fundamentally unlovable, that anyone who really knew him would eventually leave. "Nicole didn't leave because you're unlovable," Daniel said quietly. "She left because you stopped letting her love you." "Is that what you think you did? Let her love you?" "No. I let her love a fantasy. A version of you that doesn't exist because it never had to weather the real pressures of a marriage. I was an escape hatch, not a real option." "Will you see her again?" Daniel shook his head. "She needs to figure out who she is when she's not trying to fix either of us, and I need to focus on getting through treatment." "Where are you doing treatment?" "Seattle. I've got an oncologist up there I trust." "That's 4 hours from here." "Yeah." David took a breath, made a decision that felt simultaneously reckless and inevitable. "My firm has a Seattle office. I could request a transfer. Be closer in case you need anything during treatment." Daniel stared at him. "You'd do that?" "You're my brother. I missed 38 years. I'm not missing whatever comes next." "What about your life here?" David looked around the diner, the worn vinyl, the outdated decor, the comfortable shabbiness of a place that had survived because it served a purpose. "I don't think I have a life here anymore. I have a job and an apartment and routines. But Nicole was right. I don't have me. Maybe it's time to figure out who that is. It won't be easy. Treatment is ugly. I'll be sick, exhausted, probably pretty terrible company. I have a feeling terrible company runs in the family." Daniel laughed, but his voice was serious when he said, "Thank you. For this, for not hating me, for giving me a chance. Thank you for finding me." David meant it, for caring enough to disrupt everything. "I might have coasted like this for decades otherwise." They left the diner as the last light was fading from the sky. Outside, the city was coming alive with evening. People heading to dinner, to shows, to lives David had forgotten to build for himself. "This is weird," Daniel said, standing on the sidewalk beside him. "Looking at you is like looking in a mirror that shows me who I could have been. Or who you might still become. Or that." They stood there for a moment, two identical men at a crossroads, the future uncertain but no longer quite so lonely. "I should probably call my mom," David said. "Tell her she's got 2 sons instead of 1. That's going to be a hell of a conversation." "Wait until you tell her one of them is dying. Really seal the deal." "Too soon?" "Probably. But if I can't make cancer jokes, who can?" They exchanged phone numbers, email addresses, promises to stay in touch. It felt inadequate given everything that had happened, but it was a start. As David drove home through the darkening city, his phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Thank you for today, for seeing me as a brother instead of a threat. I know I don't deserve it." David pulled over to respond properly. "We're twins. We don't get to choose whether we're brothers. That's just biology. But we get to choose whether we're family." I choose family. The response came quickly. Me too. David sat in his car, watching the city move around him. Lights coming on in windows, people rushing home to lives he couldn't see. His own life was in pieces. His marriage was ending. His career would have to be put on hold. Everything he'd built over the past decade was crumbling. But for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. There was a brother he'd never known existed, fighting for his life in Seattle. There was an opportunity to start over, to figure out who David Mitchell really was when he wasn't performing for an audience of one. There was grief and loss, and a long road ahead, but there was also possibility. He started the car and pulled back into traffic, heading toward an apartment that would soon be someone else's home. Tomorrow he'd make calls about the Seattle transfer. He'd start the process of untangling a shared life. He'd figure out how to tell his parents their world was about to tilt on its axis. But tonight, he'd sit in the ruins of his old life and let himself feel everything he'd been too busy to feel for too long. The sadness, the relief, the fear, the hope. And tomorrow he'd start the work of becoming real. 3 months later, David stood in a Seattle hospital room, watching his brother sleep between chemo treatments. Daniel looked smaller than he had in the diner, hollowed out by the poison that was trying to save his life. But he was still fighting, still hanging on with the same stubborn determination David recognized in himself. Nicole had texted yesterday, friendly, brief, updating him on the divorce proceedings. She was seeing a therapist, figuring things out, dating a man who taught pottery and made her laugh. David was happy for her. He meant it. His own therapist, recommended by Daniel's oncologist, had helped him understand that he'd been running from himself for years, using work and marriage as shields against having to figure out who he really was. It was going to take time to untangle all of it, maybe years, maybe forever, but he had time. And he had Daniel, at least for now. His brother's eyes opened, focused slowly. You're still here. Where else would I be? You have a life, David. You don't have to spend every evening in this room. Actually, I do. We've got 38 years of brotherly bonding to catch up on. I figure hospital rooms are as good a place as any to start. Daniel smiled weakly. Brought the guitar? David pulled out the battered acoustic he'd found in a Seattle pawn shop. He'd never played an instrument before, but Daniel had mentioned it was something he wished they could have learned together as kids. So David was learning now. He was terrible at it, fingers clumsy on the strings, unable to keep rhythm or hit the right chords. But Daniel didn't care. He'd close his eyes and listen to his brother stumble through Blackbird for the 15th time, and sometimes he'd laugh, and sometimes he'd cry, and sometimes he'd just exist in the moment with gratitude for a family found too late, but not too late. And David would play, fingers cramping and heart full, making music that was more noise than melody but was theirs all the same. Two identical men who'd lived different lives, finding their way back to each other through mistakes and loss, and the strange grace of a phone call that changed everything. The bank had called about an identity crisis. But what David found instead was his identity. Messy, incomplete, but finally, authentically his own.